When did borders first exist? Today they often make headlines when they're not provoking two countries to slap each other, even in Europe. It's the crossing of these borders by people migrating from one country to another that raises questions. Has the principle of clear borders between states, which seems obvious to us today, always existed? Is it new, or is it a concept long embedded in human behavior? What impact has this notion had on our history in France and in Europe? So, in fact, what is a border? Well, first of all, it's what we call nowadays. Borders were long called limits, the term frontière in French having a military origin, coming from the notion of front. In the 17th century, French lexicographer Antoine Ferretier defined the border as a kingdom's or province's edge that enemies encounter head-on when they try to enter. At the end of the same century, it was the French grammarian and lexicographer who in 1680 compiled a dictionary of the French language. César Pierre Richelet, who defined the border as the limits of a country, the boundaries of kingdoms or regions. Early 20th century historian Lucien Febvre used border to mean a territorial boundary between countries in the 18th century, even though it seems that the usage is older, as we saw earlier. The Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique Dictionary, Centre National de la Recherche Lexicographique, now defines a border as the boundary of a territory or, by convention, the line separating two states. But is the concept of a border, as we understand it, a recent one? Well, no, quite the opposite. The concept already existed, for example, back in the time of ancient Egypt. The Egyptians had different terms to define these spaces. As early as the Old Egyptian Empire, physical boundaries appeared through defense and fortification systems. Later, symbolic boundaries called stelae were added, boundaries that were found at the edges of the empire ruled by Pharaoh. As for the political notion of a border, the Egyptians called it tasha and embodied the political reality of the state's border, which basically consisted of a buffer zone protecting Egypt. That is to say, its sphere of influence, where Egyptian power was exercised either directly or indirectly. This fluid zone existed in opposition to what was beyond, which was called Jer, that is, the sphere of chaos. A world that ignored Pharaoh's power was viewed as wild and hostile. Later, the Romans often regarded the limes as the empire's border, which functioned as a front line. Here, we see the military concept of a border where conquests and imperial power were exercised. There too, these limes were embodied by defense systems, the remains of which can still be found today, such as the famous Hadrian's Wall in Great Britain, or restored and reconstructed remains in present-day Germany. The decline of the Roman Empire and later the breakup of Frankish power deeply affected European politics. Thus, the idea of a border shifted from the Roman concept, similar to ours, to one unique to the Middle Ages. There was not a fixed territory that could be easily drawn on a map. Instead, individual relationships were shaped by possessions and locations, influenced by the era's political realities. In short, it's simply the feudal system, within which the limits of a ruler's power are much more fluid. Simply put, his military and political power determines this, often causing overlapping authority in the same area. That doesn't mean there weren't legally defined boundaries, because of course there were. It's just that everything was a bit more vague and sometimes more abstract than it is today. A major turning point in the history of European borders occurred when the Treaty of Westphalia was signed in 1648, ending the 30 Years' War, with the Kingdom of France playing a significant role. By defining how states operate with each other, recognizing their different forms of sovereignty and legitimacy within their borders, and establishing rules for diplomatic interaction. This model suggests modern borders first appeared in France. The increasing centralization of royal power, and thus the gradual formation of the modern state, goes hand in hand with the evolution of the concept of borders. Though part of a broader European approach, this process was carried out in the French manner. First under Minister Mazarin, appointed by Louis XIII after Cardinal Richelieu, and later by Louis XIV. The term frontier originated in the military world and also holds a political meaning. But what if the King of France wishes to rule within his borders? He must assert himself against the forces in his state and defend his domain. Louis XIV particularly relies on his military engineer, whom you have likely heard of. Of course, this is Sébastien Lepresse de Vauban, or simply Vauban. He created a method that effectively defended the Kingdom of France's borders. Vauban's logic is based on what he called the précaré, which did not refer to the entire kingdom, but especially the northern border of France then, which was exposed and hard to defend, as you can see on the screen. In short, this concept focuses on defending the kingdom with two lines of forts, facing the Habsburg territory while giving up isolated, harder-to-defend positions. So instead of defending a rigid and continuous line of fortifications or individual positions, the idea is to defend an entire defensive system, which is represented on the ground by 26 strongholds. You can actually find many of the original raised plans of these through the magnificent relief maps from the time of Louis XIV, which are on display at the Musée des Plans Reliefs. All of this was part of an effort to strengthen royal power, allowing for the disarmament of many of the fortifications within the kingdom. Some of these fortifications were under the authority of the nobles and not under royal power. This disarmament, combined with other measures, thus made it possible to reduce the political and military autonomy of the nobility. The Vauban border, thus mechanically reinforcing the central power of the Kingdom of France. This logic of Vauban's double line of fortification is replicated at other sensitive points of the kingdom. Driven by the engineer, this system exists in both Perpignan and Bayonne regions. Facing Spain, the engineer also created or reinforced other points along the kingdom's coasts and in the Alps. This area has long been disputed and marks a border between European states as shown at the Museum of Relief Maps. These installations form a solid border for the Kingdom of France. A border that's not a line or limit, but a space to defend. Their main role is to slow enemy armies trying to enter the kingdom. They will be crucial for France under Louis XIV and Louis XV to withstand prolonged wars by giving the state valuable time or serving as a deterrent. This boosts France's position and is key in its relations with other European states. The country's borders, thus embodied, allow it, among other factors, of course, to play a major role in European geopolitics, and it will directly impact the way the borders of the different European states in the region will evolve. What you need to keep in mind, however, is that the term border still refers primarily to a military space and then a geopolitical one. It's not defining the kingdom's extent, which, beyond the definition shared earlier, remains in practice, embodied by the notion of a boundary that could be unclear. It may seem odd, but not long ago there was no central administration managing this. Who would have defined the Kingdom of France's boundaries? In fact, depending on the context, it was the Secretariat of Foreign Affairs or the War Office, and sometimes other ministries, that were involved in settling and defining the boundaries of the kingdom. This was slowly fixed. Thus, in the 18th century, we see the emergence of various institutions whose goal was to precisely determine and, as a result, increasingly fix the territory corresponding to the Kingdom of France. This is how a real bureaucracy was created, notably represented by the Bureau of Boundaries, tasked with resolving many disputes, thus defining France's borders with its European neighbors. These developments coincide with more precise and widespread cartography use. And what about the notion of the so-called natural border of France? You've probably already heard about it. This idea began in the 16th century. The term border was adopted later. Other terms were once used for the area now known as France. This is seen in Charles Etienne's work, where he included it in his geographical description of the kingdom then. Several large mountains form its boundaries and ramparts, namely the Pyrenees Mountains, which separate it from Spain, and the High Alps, which divide it from Switzerland and Italy. The rest of these borders are marked by rivers. The king's geographer, André Thevet, supported this in the late 16th century, writing that France, from its first kings, was one of the best bounded provinces under the sky. The Pyrenees, Alps, and Rhine were its boundaries, though the Rhine is now lost. These descriptions were then used to define the geographical area corresponding to France, and this continued until the 17th century. At that time, jurists from several European countries first theorized the concept of a natural boundary. They would notably rely on the geographical realities of a territory, for example, represented by rivers and streams, in order to establish natural boundaries defining a given area. The Kingdom of France adopted the concept of a natural boundary in its political and diplomatic thought. While Cardinal de Richelieu was chief minister to King Louis XIII, backed by geopolitical interests, this idea let France justify and legitimize expansion to the Rhine. In contrast, it is also important to understand that, from the perspective of the Germanic peoples, the Rhine simply does not appear as a natural boundary separating the Germanic region from France, but rather as a river within the Germanic region, just as the Seine is for France. Mazarin, Richelieu's successor and chief minister to young Louis XIV, continued this idea, leading France to expand east and seize part of Alsace. In fact, Louis XIV's military engineer, the famous Vauban, who was mentioned a little earlier, also expressed this when he wrote that France could be limited by the extent of ancient Gaul, by the Alps, Jura Mountains, Switzerland, Pyrenees, Rhine, and the two seas, without ever crossing these barriers for any reason. The belief that France had natural borders lasted until the 18th century and was expressed by several geographers. The French revolutionaries then took up this idea themselves, with the deputy Danton declaring, for example, in 1793, that the borders of France are marked by nature. During this revolutionary period in the First French Empire under Napoleon, marked by wars between France and European countries, the terminology evolved. In this military context, the natural boundaries of France became, in French diplomatic language, the natural borders of France. The term became established in French political thought. At the same time, the concept of borders was understood differently. Within this concept, which in previous centuries was strictly military and geopolitical, the role of the state is central. Populations and their cultures emerged under the impetus of the French Revolution, before being gradually structured, starting from the First French Empire of Napoleon I. The Bureau of Statistics, established in 1800, was an early version of today's data center. This bureau records languages spoken in French departments. This will then allow mapping the boundaries between areas linked to linguistic practices within France. The movement is also gradually taking place elsewhere in Europe, as cultural identity becomes an issue in many countries. To give you a few examples, in the early 19th century, Central European languages and cultures became a concern for German states, especially for the Kingdom of Prussia, which thus conceptualized cultural and linguistic boundaries specific to the so-called German people in Europe. Another example, in the 1840s, a map of Slavic languages was created in this spirit by the Slovak historian Šafárik. By 1860, or perhaps earlier, the idea of a linguistic frontier, not just a boundary, emerged and played a major political role in European history. This contributed to evolving the term frontier from its original military meaning to a broader concept that could be applied in different contexts. The concept of a frontier stems from the military and political realities of France and Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was first represented by fortifications, as shown at the Musée des Plans Reliefs. Over the decades, the notion has come to encompass increasingly diverse realities. Remember, a border only exists where there is political will to establish it. And this is true regardless of the geographical, cultural, and ethnic realities of a territory. Above all, it is a conventional reality created by human societies for thousands of years. The term now no longer means an area facing a geopolitical rival, unlike Vauban's border. It's just seen as an administrative and legal boundary between two sovereign states. With that, I'll end with a question. Do you know why exactly the France of Louis XIV, whose geopolitical logic we've seen a part of today, went to venture into India? Did you know, by the way, that France was at one time nothing less than the leading European power on the subcontinent, ahead of the British and the Dutch? If you couldn't answer one of these questions, the next video is made for you.